I admit that I know that a lot of you are here to see Cynthia Ozick tonight, as am I. And I hope that some of you are here to see me, and I sometimes, in the last few days especially, have become somewhat self-conscious of this because I did a reading about a week ago, and afterwards there was a signing line, and it was, to my surprise, long, and at the end of this long wait, the very last person on this line was a young woman, and she came up to me and she handed me the book, and she said, "Oh, I love the movie of your book so much." And I had to say there hasn't been any movies of any of my books, and she said, "The Nanny Diaries." So, in case any of you are here for Nicole Krauss, Cynthia Ozick is reading, Nicole Krauss is reading, but Nicole Krauss is not here tonight. I'm going to read to you from a passage that's actually somewhere close to the end of the book. It won't give anything away. For those of you who haven't read the book, and I imagine that's most of you, this book has 4 different sort of first-person monologues, almost confessions, really. And so to read to you from this one won't ruin anything, even though it's so late in the book. My water has my name on it. I drank from Cynthia's. So all you have to know about this, get all of your laughing done now, because this part is really not funny. All you have to know about this character is that it's a man. His name is Aaron. He's Israeli, and his wife has very recently died. He has 2 sons. Uri is his older son. Dov is his younger son. And all his life, Dov as a child, he has felt he has never understood. And at the end of his life, this son returns following the mother's death. And the 2 of them, father and estranged son, are sort of rattling around in this house together. The son left Israel many years ago, became a well-known judge, but really never came home until now, like 25 years later. And here's a father who is addressing this grown child, but the child's actually not there. He's wandering around the woods right now. It's sort of the middle of the night. And the father's sort of asking one last time, or a final chance to be heard, and to himself to try to understand this child who perhaps he never tried hard enough to understand. Here, let me begin. You see, my child, a little bit every day I find myself contemplating my death, investigating it, dipping my toe, as it were, not practicing so much as interrogating its conditions while I still possess powers of interrogation and can still fathom oblivion. In one of these little excursions into the unknown, I uncovered something about you that I'd almost forgotten. For the first 3 years of your life, you knew nothing of death. You thought that it would all go on without end. On the first night you left your crib behind to sleep in a bed, I came to say good night to you. Now I'm going to sleep in a big boy bed forever? Yes, I said, and we sat together. I imagine you on a flight through the halls of eternity, clutching your blankie, and you imagining whatever a child imagines when he tries to conceive of forever. A few days later, you were sitting at the table playing with the food that you refused to eat. So don't eat, I said. But if you don't eat, you can't leave the table. It's as simple as that. Your lip began to tremble. Go ahead and sleep there for all I care, I said. This isn't how Mama does it, you whined. I don't care how she does it, I spat. This is how I do it, and you're not moving until you eat. You burst into tears, protesting and carrying on. I ignored you. After a while, silence filled the room, punctuated only by your little whimpers. Then, out of nowhere, you announced, When Yoela dies, we'll get a dog. I was surprised because of the bluntness of the statement and because I had no idea you knew anything of death. Won't you be sad when she dies, I asked, forgetting for a moment the war of the food. And you very practically replied, yes, because then we won't have a cat to pet. A moment passed. What does it look like when people die, you asked. As if they're asleep, I said, only they don't breathe. You thought about this. Do children die, you asked? I felt a pain open in my chest. Sometimes, I said. Perhaps I should have chosen other words, never or simply no. But I didn't lie to you. At least you can say that of me. Then turning your little face to me without flinching, you asked, will I die? And as you said the words, horror filled me as it had never before. Tears burned my eyes, and instead of saying what I should have said, not for a long, long time, or not you, my child, you alone will live forever, I said simply, yes. And because no matter how you suffered, deep inside you are still an animal like any other who wants to live, feel the sun, and be free, you said, but I don't want to die. The terrible injustice of it filled you, and you looked at me as if I were responsible. You'd be surprised by how often in my little peripatetic wanderings through the valley of death, I meet the child you once were. At first it surprised me too, but soon I came to look forward to these encounters. I tried to think about why it was that you would appear like that when the subject had so little to do with you. I came to realize it had to do with certain feelings I felt for the first time when you were a child. I don't know why Uri didn't arouse the same feelings before you. Maybe I was caught up in other things when he was an infant, or maybe I was still too young. There were only 3 years between you, but in those years I grew up, my youth officially came to an end, and I entered a new stage of life as a father and a man. By the time you were born, I understood in a way that I could not have with Uri just what the birth of a child means, how he grows and how his innocence is slowly ruined, how his features change forever the first time he feels shame, how he comes to learn the meaning of disappointment, of disgust, how a whole world is contained inside of him, and it was mine to lose. I felt powerless against these things, and of course you were a different kind of child than Uri. From the beginning you seemed to know things and to hold them against me, as if you somehow understood that built into raising a child are inevitable acts of violence against him. Looking down into the crib at your tiny face contorted by screams of grief, I was guilty before I'd even begun. I know how this sounds. After all, you were only a baby. But something about you attacked the weakest part of me, and I backed away. Yes, you as you were then, with your fair hair before it turned coarse and dark. I've heard others say that when their children were born, they tasted their own mortality for the first time. But it wasn't that way for me. That isn't the reason I find you hiding there in the shallows of my death. I was too caught up in myself, in the battles of my life, to notice the little winged messenger come to take the torch from my hand and silently pass it on to Uri and you. To notice that from that moment on, I would no longer be the center of all things, the crucible where life, to keep itself alive, burns most vividly. The fire began to cool in me, but I didn't notice. I carried on living as if it was life that needed me, and not vice versa. And yet you taught me something of death. Almost without my being aware of it, you smuggled the knowledge into me. Not long after you asked me whether you would die, I heard you talking aloud in the other room. When we die, you said, we'll be hungry. A simple statement, and then you went on humming off tune and pushing your little cars across the floor. But it stayed with me. It seemed to me that no one had ever summed up death quite like that, an unending state of longing with no hope of receiving. I was almost scared by the equanimity with which you faced something so abysmal, how you looked at it, turned it over in your mind as best you could, and found a form of clarity that allowed you to accept it. Maybe I'm ascribing too much meaning to the words of a 3-year-old, but however accidental, there was beauty in them. In life, we sit at the table and refuse to eat, and in death, we're eternally hungry. How can I explain it? The way you frightened me a little, how you seemed just the tiniest bit closer than the rest of us to the essence of things. I would walk into a room and find you staring at something in the corner. What's so fascinating, I wanted to know. But your concentration would be broken and you would turn to me, a wrinkle in your brow, a faint look of surprise at being disturbed. After you left the room, I would go to see for myself. A spider web, an ant, a disgusting hairball coughed up by Yoella. But there was never anything there. What's wrong with him, I asked your mother. He has no friends? By that time, Ori had already befriended the whole neighborhood. There was an endless stream of kids coming in and out of the house for him. The only time Ori spent in the corner was when he was wrapping his arms around himself and wriggling as if he were French kissing. He would run his hands up and down his back, squeeze his own ass, and give a little yelp, screwing his head back and forth in an imitation that made everyone roll on the floor. But amid the laughter, you were nowhere to be found. Later, pruning the tomato plants, I came across a patch of the garden where you had mysteriously assembled little piles of dirt in rows, alternating with squares or circles etched into the ground with a stick. What the hell is this? I asked your mother. She cocked her head to study it. It's a city, she announced, without a shade of doubt in her voice. Here's the gate, she pointed, and the fortifications, and this here's a cistern. Then she walked away, leaving me defeated again. Where I saw little pathetic piles of dirt, she saw a whole city. From the beginning, you had given her the keys to yourself, but not to me, never to me, my son. I spotted you crouching near the hose. Come here, I shouted. You lumbered toward me on your short legs, your face crazily stained from a popsicle. What is the meaning of this? I demanded, gesturing with the clippers. You looked down and sniffed. Then you squatted and carried out some lightning renovations, hurriedly sweeping, patting, refashioning a lump. You stood to examine it again from above, cocking your head at the same angle your mother had. So that was the secret, I thought. You have to turn your head at a special angle to make sense of it. No sooner had I absorbed this clue than you lifted your foot and with a few quick stomps, leveled the entire thing and retreated into the house. Which came first? Was it I who backed away, or you? A strange child with secret knowledge that I came to resent, who grew to be a young man whose world was barred to me. Do you want to know the truth, Dove? When you came to tell me about the book you planned to write, I was taken aback. I couldn't understand what made you decide to come to me of all people, me with whom you shared so little of yourself, whom you only spoke to as a last resort when it was absolutely necessary. I was too slow to respond as I might have liked. I couldn't change so fast. I assumed the old position, a certain tone of voice, a roughness that had always been my defense against all I couldn't grasp in you, to reject you before you could reject me. Afterwards, I regretted it. The moment after you walked out of the room, I realized that I'd lost my chance. I understood that you had offered me a reprieve, and I'd squandered it, and I knew it would not come again. All of this was long ago, and yet against my will I find myself returning to it, as if to touch ritually one last time every enduring pocket of pain. No, the powerful emotions of youth don't mellow with time. One gets a grip on them, cracks a whip, forces them down. You build your defenses, insist on order. The strength of feeling doesn't lessen, it's simply contained. But now the walls begin to buckle. I find myself thinking of my parents, Dovey, of certain images of my mother in shadowy evening light in the kitchen, and I see her expression meant something different than I had understood it to mean as a child. She would lock herself in the bathroom and was reduced to mere sound, muffled through the door, my ear to it. To me, my mother was first and foremost a smell, indescribable, pass over it. Then a feeling, her hands on my back, the soft wool of her coat against my cheek. Then the sound of her, and at the end of all that, a distant fourth, the sight of her. How she looked to me only in parts, never the whole. So large and I so small that at any one time I could only take in a curve, or the swelling of flesh over a belt, or the slope of freckles down to the bosom, or the legs sheathed in stockings. Any more was impossible. After she died, my father lived on almost another decade, steadying the one shaking hand with the other. I used to find him in his underwear, unshaven with the blinds drawn, a meticulous, even vain man in a stained undershirt. It took him a full year before he began to dress again. Other things were never righted or repaired. I have no idea at all what his thoughts were about the afterlife. We didn't speak of personal things. We saluted each other from across a great distance, from mountain peak to mountain peak. He died peacefully in his bed, not a dirty dish in the sink. After filling a glass of water, he would wipe the sink dry so that the steel would remain, true to name, stainless. For a few years, I lit the yahrzeit candle for them both, but then I lost the habit. I can count on one hand the number of times I visited their graves. The dead are dead. If I want to visit them, I have my memories. This is how I looked at it, if I looked at it at all. But even the memories I kept at bay. Is there not always some slight but unmistakable rebuke in the death of those closest? Is that what you will make of my death, Dove? A final installment of the long rebuke you took to be my life? I was nearing the end, and then you came home. You stood holding your suitcase in the hall, and I thought it seemed a beginning. Am I too late? Where are you? You should have been home hours ago. What's keeping you? Something isn't right. I can feel it. Your mother's no longer here to worry. Now it falls to me. For 10 days I woke up and found you here, sitting at this table, so short a time, and yet I already had come to depend on it. But this morning, the morning I came down the stairs prepared to break the silence and offer a truce at last, the table was empty. There's a pressure mounting in my chest. I can't pass over it. For 10 days we have lived under the same roof, and you've hardly spoken. We move through the day like two hands of a clock. Sometimes we overlap for a moment, then come apart again, carrying on alone. Every day exactly the same, the tea, the burnt toast, the crumbs, the silence, you in your chair, I in mine. Except today when I woke and for the first time I coughed in the hallway, entered the kitchen, and no one was there. Your chair was empty. I promised myself I would wait until we were ready, that I wouldn't push. Yesterday I came across you standing in the garden, a strange stiffness in your posture, as if you carried a wooden yoke like the old Dutch. Only instead of water, it was great reserves of feeling that you wished not to spill. I tried not to disturb you. Afraid to say the wrong thing, I've said nothing at all. But every day there's a little bit less of me, just the tiniest bit, almost immeasurable, and yet I feel life slipping away. You don't have to tell me that you don't have to tell me what you don't want to tell me about your life. I won't ask you what happened, why you resigned, why you suddenly gave up the only thing that has kept you bound to life all these years. I can live without knowing that. But what I need to know is why you've come back to me. I need to ask, will you visit me once I'm gone? Will you come from time to time and sit with me? It's absurd. I'll be nothing, just a handful of inert material, and yet I feel it would help me to go more easily if I knew you would come sometimes. To sweep around the headstone and pick a stone to set there with the others, if there are others. Just to think that you would come even once a year. I know how it sounds given the oblivion I've never doubted awaits me. When I first began my little wanderings through the valley of death and discovered within myself this desire, I too was surprised. I remember exactly how it happened. Ori came to take me to the doctor one morning. Overnight, a tiny spot of darkness had lodged in the vision of my right eye. It was just a speck, but this little void drove me crazy. Everything I looked at was marred by it. I started to panic. What if another spot appeared, and then another? Like being buried alive, one shovel of dirt at a time, until there was only a prick of light left, and then nothing. Having worked myself into a state, I called Uri. An hour later, he phoned back that he'd made an appointment and would come for me. We went to see the doctor. None of this is important. Afterwards, we got in the car to go home. We were driving when out of nowhere, a rock hit the windshield. The bang was tremendous. Both of us flew out of our skin, and Uri slammed on the brakes. We sat in silence, barely breathing. The road was empty. There was no one around. By some miracle, it took us a moment to fully grasp the glass had not broken. The only mark in it was a divot the size of a fingerprint, almost exactly between my eyes. A moment later, I saw the rock resting in the recess of the windshield wipers. Had it gone through the glass, it might have killed me. I got out of the car, my legs trembling, and took hold of the stone. It filled my palm, and when I closed my fingers around it, it fit perfectly in my fist. Here's the first, I thought. The first stone to mark my grave. The first stone placed like a period at the end of my life. Soon the mourners will come bringing stone after stone to anchor the long sentence that was my life to its final strangled syllable. And then, my child, I thought of you. I realized that I didn't care if the others came, that the only one whose stone I wanted was yours, Dov, the stone that can mean so many things to a Jew, but in your hand could mean only one. My child, my love and my regret, as you were when I first laid eyes on you, a tiny old man who hadn't had time to brush off his ancient expression, naked and misshapen in the nurse's arms. Dr. Bartov, my old friend, who broke the rules so that I could be present, turned to me and asked if I wanted to cut the cord, bulging, whitish blue and twisted, so much thicker than I'd ever imagined, more like a rope for tying a boat, and without thinking, I agreed. Just like this, he said, he who had done it 1,000 times before. So I did, and suddenly it began to dance like a snake in my hands, and blood spurted around the room, splashing the walls like the scene of a heinous crime. And you opened your eyes. I swear you opened your tiny, wet eyes, my child, and looked at me as if to fix in your mind forever the face of the one who had separated you from her. At that moment, I was filled with something. It was as if a pressure had been blown into me, expanding everything, pushing at the walls from within, as if I were being besieged from the inside, if that's possible. And I thought I would explode from it all, from love and regret, Dov, love and regret as I never thought possible. In that instant, I understood with surprise that I had become your father. The surprise lasted less than a minute because your mother began to hemorrhage and one nurse gathered you up and hurried you away while the other pushed me out of the door and deposited me in the waiting room, where the men who had not yet seen their children looked at my bloody shoes and trembling lip and began to cough and shake. I want you to know that I never gave up being your father, Dov. Sometimes, driving to work, I found myself talking aloud to you, pleading, reasoning with you, or consulting with you about an especially difficult case, or just telling you about the aphids attacking my tomatoes, or the simple omelet I made for myself one morning before your mother was awake and ate alone in the bright silence of the kitchen. And when she fell ill, it was you I talked to while I sat in hard plastic chairs waiting for her to emerge from another procedure, another treatment, another test. I made a little scarecrow of you in my mind, and I talked as if you could hear me. The second time they bombed the number 18 bus, I was 2 blocks away. The remains were everywhere. I watched the Special Orthodox arrive to collect the splattered dead, to scrape the bits from the sidewalk with tweezers, to go up a ladder, to peel a shred of ear from a high branch. Afterwards, I couldn't talk to anyone about it, not even your mother, but I talked to you. True kindness, that's what they call themselves, the ones who arrive in their kippot and their day-glow yellow vests, always the first there to hold the dying as they go in shocked silence. True kindness, because the dead cannot repay the favor. Yes, it was you I spoke to when I woke with nightmares. You I addressed when I looked at myself to shave in the mirror. I found you everywhere, hiding in the most unlikely places, and though at first I wondered why, soon enough I realized it was because I believed I could learn something from you, from your example. You who had always been so gifted at giving up, of letting go, of making yourself lighter and lighter, less and less, one friend at a time, one father less, one wife less. And now you have even given up being a judge. There's almost nothing anymore to tether you to the world. You're like a dandelion with only 1 or 2 hairs left. How easy it would be for you, with a little cough, a little sigh, to blow the last one away. Suddenly I'm frightened of. I feel a shiver. A coldness is seeping into my veins. For once, I think I understand. What do I understand? Is it possible you've come to say goodbye again? That you intend to put an end at last? Wait, Dovik, don't go. Remember how I used to put you to sleep at night? Always you wanted one more question. Where does the sun go at night? What do wolves eat? Why is there only one of me? One more question, Dovik. One more song. 5 more minutes. What would she do? Where are you? All your life I've been asking. I'll put on my shoes. I'll get down on my knees. I'll never mention it again. I'll do what your mother would have done. I'll call every hospital. Thank you.
It's my happy duty to introduce Cynthia Ozick, and I want to say something about her newest novel, Foreign Bodies. Foreign Bodies reimagines Henry James's ambassadors. Once again, the New World sends an American abroad to save one of its sons from the influences of old Europe. This time, it's post-World War II Europe. There's a wonderful line, drained of its well-advertised enchantments. The ambassador is Bee Nachtigall, or Bee Nightingale, whose secret ambition, as she tells her sometime husband, is to write a dictionary. And I quote, "I mean, it wouldn't be a dictionary of words, nothing like that, nothing that ever existed before. Things," she means, "that start out hidden, and then you find them out." Poor Bee, the sometime husband has railroaded her into a life of teaching high school, but Bee's creator fulfills Bee's ambition. For what does the novel do except find things out that start hidden? If in the beginning of the world the animals marched past Adam so that he would tell them their names, it's our life that passes before the novelist. Moods, smells, feelings that everyone's somehow felt, only there's no name for them. It is our poet-novelist who finds them their names. We, the fortunate readers, read what Cynthia has written, and we say, why, that's just the way it is, only more so, prodigiously more so. The best way, surely, to celebrate Cynthia Ozick is to look at some words on her page. Let's look through the eyes of the dreadful Marvin, Bee's brother. He's the one who sends her abroad. He's sitting across the table from the woman he will marry because she's the sister of a Princeton classmate. Her blood was satisfyingly blue. She had relatives in the State Department. You and I think we have seen another person drink a glass of water. Not like this, we haven't. She paused to sip water, and he saw how the rim of the glass slipped into the gap between her lips. He had never observed this action with so much suspense. It was punishing in its slow motion efficiency. Cynthia Ozick boldly asserts the sovereignty of words over music. Words, she writes, the sovereignty of words, their excluding particularity. This is language. In another context, Cynthia Ozick has said that she will not let go of a sentence until it is scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed. Scrubbed, she means, of everything that is not the particularity of that particular mood, the smell, the feeling. You'd think, wouldn't you, that this is a prescription for an austere minimalism? Not a bit. Because what B. Nightingale is after, as she confided to that old sometime husband, is to be attached in some intimate way to a marvel, a force, a prodigy, the other side of the moon where ordinary mortals could never go, or to plummet into the sun. Here, finally, is a riff on the particularity of some pages of musical annotation. What was she to make of these scatterings of blotches moving up and down the staff lines like bugs on an escalator? The mutating, voiceless Tower of Babel, foreign matter. She understood nothing. She fanned out the loosened sheets like giant playing cards on her broad dining table. There were too many not to overlap. Black blisters bursting out of naked stems, black balloons and on thin sticks, bottomless black wells, 5 stripes, a 5-lane highway, small black cars speeding. Please welcome the prodigious Cynthia Ozick.
Thank you. Queen Elizabeth came to America, and she was too short for the podium, so nothing showed but her hat. So thank you, Laurie, from the bottom of my heart, fellow novelist and treasured friend. I'm happy to be here tonight together with Nicole Krauss, our star. You may have noticed the seasonal theme of this podium pairing, May and December. And I trust you will have no difficulty deciding which is May and which is December, though I'd rather be November because December is, well, the end. Or else autumnal October when the leaves are still lively. Well, there are marriages that are vernal and autumnal as well, and we secretly wonder at them. How did two such unlike partners happen to find each other? The section of Foreign Bodies I'll read from describes just such a moment of unlikely encounter that will rather startlingly lead to an unusual marriage. In 1952, Julian is 23. He's gone to Paris for junior year abroad, but now it's been 3 years. He seems to be an idler, and he still hasn't returned home to Los Angeles. His father, a self-made mogul, the Jewish grandson of an immigrant peddler of pots and pans, rages to have him come back. His mother, a Boston blue blood, is sickened by his prolonged absence. She, by the way, was born a Breckinridge. You may recognize the name. Breckinridge was the State Department official who, in the Hitler era, was instrumental in keeping out Jewish refugees seeking haven in America. Lily, a 35-year-old native of Bucharest who might have been one of those refugees, is instead a survivor of Transnistria, a brutal camp in Romania where her husband and small child were shot. And here is how Julian met Lily. For his 23rd birthday, Julian received a check from his father. accompanied by a business-like note explaining how to circumvent the bank's discount on foreign money so as to change dollars into francs without a loss of value. His father was good at such shortcuts, but Julian was indifferent. He had no intention of beginning what was certain to become a quarrel with some factotum in a bank. And anyhow, Marvin's instructions, thickened by numbers and percentages, were over his head. It was enough that the figure on the blue paper rectangle promised another installment on Madame Duval's rent and a whole week free of waiting on tables. Not that Julian despised shortcuts in general. It was Alfred who had introduced him to a certain Francois who got him jobs under the table, or however they said this in French. And it was through Alfred that his little thing on the Marais had reached the princess, and from the princess had ascended to print. Print. It had happened twice, but now Alfred was dead, and he was on his own without an intermediary, though he still kept a covetous eye on the Paris Review. Without Alfred, who was fearless and knew everyone, he had no chance there. He wasn't good enough. He wasn't diligent enough or confident enough. He was what they called him at home, a Luftmensch, or at least his father called him that. His mother wouldn't have known such a word. It meant an inconsequential person, an impracticality made of air. His mother would have defended him. He had read about those legendary writers who sat in a favorite cafe every morning, driving their pens, oblivious to everything around them, the clatter and chatter, the passers-by, the street noises, the car horns. He had never witnessed anything like that, which didn't imply that it couldn't be done. And as a matter of fact, he was doing it right now, not in the morning. He didn't get up early if he didn't have to, but at 2:00 in the afternoon at Le Tisserand, where he had never worked and wasn't known and wouldn't be laughed at. About the check, he was both happy and resentful. Happy because he could loiter here with a bottle of beer and his smooth new notebook with its margins marked in red, and resentful because he understood that the money was both a bribe and a threat. 1 more month, his father had written below the numbers and the percentages, and then home. Those 6 monosyllables pounded like gongs. A brief chirp from his mother. "Are you all right, Julian? We miss you." Nothing from his sister. She had other means. She hid his letters and answered them secretly. He had already filled 4 pages. His idea was to invent a series of clever little fables in style, something between Aesop and Rochefoucauld. Alfred had put him on to Rochefoucauld, with morals at the end, only the morals wouldn't be morals. He would call them immorals, and they'd be the opposite of what his deceptively straight-faced tales appeared to prescribe or warn against. And the language would be simple and transparent, a term he had learned from Alfred. But Alfred was unhelpfully dead, and the Paris Review had already sent back 6 of his fables. He thought he should find another name for them. It had begun to rain, at first lightly, and a deadening of the air and the smell of wet pavement drifting in from the outdoors excited him a little. It was the smell of anticipation. Then it darkened, and a dimness settled over where he sat against a rear wall with his feet on a chair belonging to a nearby table, and the rain hurtled down with a tropical force and dense gray curtains that flew in from the street. A rowdy party of 3 or 4 young girls dashed in, instantly soaked through, laughing and tugging at their backpacks. There was a lycée in the neighborhood. He liked looking at them. The rounded calves above their low socks, the rise of the small hillocks just under their collarbones, dripping hair falling to the middle of their backs. They were 12 or 13 or even 14, and right behind them, a middle-aged woman. He presumed the woman was a teacher, she was carrying a briefcase, or else the mother of one of the girls, but she quickly separated herself from the group and left them standing in the doorway, giggling and squeezing the water from one another's hair and braiding it into pigtails. The woman spotted a vacant table and opened her briefcase. Rain trickled from its sides. But Julian kept his eye on the girls. Only one of them was really pretty. He wished she were older, 18, say. If she were 18 or 20, he would get up and sidle close and tease her in his improving French. Or if she were one of those American girls, but no, she wasn't. The whole noisy bunch of them had erupted out of that lycée down the street. Those American girls who were everywhere nowadays, in every corner of the city. He could start out as he always did with American girls. So, which one are you, Gertrude or Alice? Which was, of course, a sort of test to earn him either an ignorant retort or an invitation to say his name and where he was from and what he was doing in Paris, and after that, who could tell what might follow? Especially if it turned out she was one of those French majors from Vassar or Smith or Bryn Mawr who always knew who Gertrude and Alice were. And that was the joke of it. He learned from the photographs that Gertrude and Alice were ugly and old. In fact, they looked like ugly old men, squat, and, he guessed, pigeon-toed. The woman who had hurried in along with that gaggle of wild girls, the pretty one couldn't have been more than 13, wasn't exactly ugly, and not as old as he had at first imagined, but he'd had only a flash of her. She was no one he would ordinarily notice. He was noticing her now only because she was a distraction, more from the girls than from his little cat fable, which was faltering anyhow. She was pulling a sheet of paper and a mechanical pencil, the kind his father kept in his breast pocket, out of that briefcase, cheap cardboard flaking off at the seams. It wasn't made to be rained on. She had arranged her things, a long-sleeved sweater and a bag with the oval end of a bread sticking out, 2 chairs away from where he sat. The one in between had his feet on it, and he could almost see what she was writing. It had the commonplace shape of a letter, and at once he lost interest. She wasn't a fellow inventor of fables. She wasn't pretty. She wasn't young. She wasn't a sort he would ever approach to ask about Gertrude or Alice. She was only a woman who had come in out of the wet. A slash of sunlight cut into his eyes, reflected from a passing windshield. The storm was suddenly spent. The sea salt aroma of after rain hissed up from the sidewalk, and the girls with their pigtails and knapsacks tumbled out, shrieking, into the renewed afternoon. He tried to put his mind to his story, a free-spirited yet dutiful cat who always returns obediently home after a day of carousing in alleys. And what was the immoral of that? He couldn't think. He was impatient with it. It was stupid. He was bored. He didn't want to be the cat who comes submissively home. But he was homesick all the same, or at any rate, sick. He felt sick, partly in his stomach, partly he hardly knew how. He admitted to tedium, to looseness, to nothingness. It was all over with the crowd he'd been running with, that brilliant crowd Alfred was in the middle of. Alfred, who could reel off a comic disquisition on a pubic hair held between thumb and forefinger. The rape of the lock, he said. He'd run with them and drunk with them, but he wasn't of them. He didn't belong. He was always on the periphery. He tried and tried. He flattered them and scurried to catch up with them. He tried to deserve them. But finally, they were sick of him, or he was sick of them. He couldn't tell the difference. Either way, it left him out. It was their brilliance he was sick of. It didn't stick. It was all mobility. It rolled here and there, aimlessly, quip after quip. His immorals, too, were no more than shallow quips. But the real trouble was the cat. He needed a bigger animal, one that would be capable of frightening the family when it returned. A bear, a fearsome grizzly bear. No, what household would keep a bear for a pet? Besides, once let out, a bear would be a fool to come back to domestic life, where undoubtedly it would have to resume the chain. "Damn, I can't do it," he said. The woman glanced up, and he realized he had spoken aloud. He was embarrassed, but only a little. Lately, he sometimes talked to himself. It was anger that did it, lava foaming up out of a dried-up throat. He didn't care. He could do as he pleased. He could yell in the street if he liked. At 3 a.m. once, coming finely, dizzily, boisterously soused out of the Napoleon, Alfred 3 sheets to the wind, the pair of them yelling into the sky, yelling into the night, fat, glorious American yells. And hey, listen, Alfred said, which was the real wilderness anyway, the New World? It had aged substantially by now, or the old? It felt marvelous, with Alfred's arms around his neck. But Alfred had killed himself. Alfred was dead, not to know whether he had or didn't have a body. The woman said, "Then you must persist." This old thing was answering him as if he expected it, or needed it, or wanted it. The look she was giving him was both more and less than annoyance, the kind of look you turn on a child who throws a stone that seems about to strike you but doesn't. It made him believe even more than before that she must be a teacher from the lycée, some sour-tongued harridan that rough pack of girls had determined to snub. He took his feet off the chair. This small, grudging feint toward propriety, she'd caught him out, she'd shamed him, made her laugh. She was laughing at him. From that first sound, it was plain she wasn't French. She certainly wasn't American. What was she? Even a laugh can have a foreign chime in it. And this intrusive woman, with that elderly furrow between her eyebrows, was laughing at him. The boy was absurd. The boy was contemptible. The self-consciousness of it, lord of the world, commandeering a flock of chairs as if he owned the planet Earth, one of those know-nothing Americans besotted with old, tattered visions of Sartre, that dolt, that foul communist, that abettor of the worst. Paris was infested with these imitation baby Sartres and Gides sitting in cafes over their inky manuscripts, an aperitif placed just so at the nearest knuckle to authenticate the parody, the foolish superannuated play acting. And this one in romantic agony over some tragic flaw in his genius. A plaything, their Paris, a toy. They would wear it out, it would wear them out, one or the other would be discarded. And when they were done with it, away they'd go. How easy to fly off with their easy American passports to those waiting rich cities and their movie-toned skyscrapers, their happy Clevelands and Chicagos and Bostons. They could come and they could go, ignorant that the ground was scorched. So obliviously soft was it under their feet. And here was this raw, entitled boy with his big, dirty shoes up on a chair. So Lily laughed, and in her oddly arranged English snapped out her little mockery and went back to writing to her uncle. But the stupid boy didn't take it for the indifferent jibe it was, simple, low sarcasm. Or if he did, he was pitifully in want of conversation and would put out his tongue for any crumb of human warmth. She had no warmth to give him. She was cold. Her warmth was for her poor lost mother's brother, far away where she had unearthed him. It was her intention to go to him in 2 months, in 3. Lonely then. The boy ought to be on his way. He had a family somewhere. Why should he persist? Persist in what? In play acting in a cafe? She had seen them everywhere, their drinking, their raucousness, their play acting, make-believe exile, an ephemeral game. The ground was scorched. The streets teemed with refugees, and these Americans were playing at fleeing, as if they had something to resent, to despise, to scorn, to run away from, as if they weren't the lords of the earth. Yet this lord of the earth was looking at her unhappily, angrily, bitterly. His sorrows, whatever they were trivial. He was uneducated. His ignorance was no different from innocence. But she could smell the fume of bitterness. "Am I a joke?" he said, because she had laughed. And who wouldn't laugh at such a travesty? "Oh, yes," she said, "exactly so, because there are so many of you." So many what? Only see how ready he is to be belligerent. So many purposeless, a carnival to pass the time. You come here, and you do not know why. He was being scolded. Worse, he was being exposed, and by an imperious, meddlesome woman who thought herself a clairvoyant, as if he had no right to be whatever he was. She was taking him to be part of a crowd, and he had given up the crowd. It wasn't fair. A pang of missing. Only his sister was sympathetic. Well, his mother too, but she was so much under his father's thumb. "You don't know me," he said, "so don't judge me." In his own ears, he sounded childish. "You should go home," she said. "I can't." "And why is that?" "I have no home." Oh, portentous, this caricature, this scion of good fortune claiming homelessness. "No? Then where do you come from?" He let it out like a worm. "California." "So that is your home, is it not?" Though he might have said Antarctica for all the reality it had. "Getting born in a place," he retorted, "doesn't make it your home, not if they don't treat you like you're an actual person." She was drawing him in, he supposed, with the intention of drawing him out. Why should he allow it? Why should he tell her anything at all? Already he had said too much, again that childish speechifying. Now he examined her in earnest. How small she was, the jutting collarbone, the narrow well above the upper lip, the bitten flesh of the lip itself, white fingers still gripping that mechanical pencil. And that laugh again, scorn, a kind of hollowness in it. Was he a joke? "You speak better than you know," she said. He was mistaken. She wasn't old, 35 or so. It was only her voice that seemed aged. Such voices belonged to greenhorn immigrants in remote pockets of New York. He had seen the old films, the push carts, the shuffling old babushkas, the old men. He knew his father had had an immigrant grandfather, but not his mother, no. It was a kind of family secret. His father had contempt for alien accents. He derided them. They offended him. She saw how perplexed he was. Bitter. Why bitter? A bewildered boy. He understood nothing. California, a fairyland. Deanna Durbin, Fred Astaire, singing, dancing movies while the world burned. And he, because of that voice with its awkward foreign approximations overlaid by an unfamiliar cadence, it was too quick and also too slow. It was wrong. And the vibrating burr of her throaty R, he felt it, it stung him, he submitted to it. What she was. One of them, the ghosts of the Marais, those vagabond pigeons pecking at scraps underfoot. You were required, if you weren't repelled, to pity them, dirty things, a kind of litter in themselves. But if you pitied, even a little, they might brighten sleekly into doves, cosmopolitan knowers with hidden histories brought low by a wicked whirlwind. Doves were what he had named them. And when they landed, astoundingly, in the pages of Merlin, Alfred's doing, doves they remained. And she, observing just then, in the darkening of those pale eyes, some inescapable recognition, she took in the notebook with its red margins. Suppose she was too hastily contemptuous. Suppose there was a worthiness in that notebook. A boy in his 20s can think worthily. Eugene in his 20s was worthy and even beautiful, not unlike this stretched-out boy with his big shoulders and sadly pointed chin above a softly plump neck, and the scraggle of mustache, and the uncut hair, and the broad nose with its curled lobes. But she did not wish to think of Eugene, and she did not wish to think of Mikhail. She cast them away, Eugene and Mikhail. She purged her eyes when they forced their way into them, a black purge like a vomiting. So they came together that afternoon, Lily and Julian, between ridicule and condescension, between vacuousness and uproar. He croaked out his California, the land of unknowing, no better than fabricated cats and bears. She bled out her Transnistria, where too much was known and nothing he could imagine. She covered it over for him. The typhus, dysentery, starvation, shootings, the shootings and shootings, mother, father, Eugene, Mikhail. And then only Lily alone, with this ugly hole in her arm, she covered it over, from a failed shot, and the uncle lately uncovered in a far place, the black devil's Transnistria, and afterward, the red devil's Bucharest, welter and waste, but she covered it over. It came of pity. She pitied him because of his emptiness. He pitied her because she had been full and was stripped, and because of the hideous hole in her arm. She told him she intended to go to her uncle. Her uncle was living in Bat Yam, a town on the sea not far from Jaffa. Her uncle was expecting her, and did Julian know Jaffa? He didn't. Where Jonah sailed from, she said. He barely knew Jonah. He had no religion. But in the end, it took more than a month. She went with him to carry his things away from Madame Duval's. The two of them agreed, how difficult it had been to persuade her, to live for a while in Dr. Montalbano's unoccupied flat. She had much to teach him. He had nothing to give her but the miracle of his gratitude. What she taught him was Europe. She thickened his mind, and he entered her body gratefully. He forgot pity, she, who had less of it, because in truth he deserved less, forgot it too. Thank you.
Thank you both. Just a few questions. We'll start with one for both of you. Maybe Cynthia, you could go first. It says, do you think Europeans carry their country's history differently than Americans do? And how would such a distinction affect your approach to writing characters who were American or European?
Well, the theme of this book is Europe versus America, or America versus Europe, and I said it in 1952 specifically because this was the moment when you could say Europe was recuperating from the deadly fumes that was still, at least metaphorically, in the air from the gas chambers. And it seemed to me that the Jamesian notion of Europe as the center of culture, music, art, everything, the glory of civilization had been murdered in those years of the Hitler era. And so I still feel that America, though imperfect, and I did set this in 1952 when there was the Korean War and McCarthyism was dreadful and frightening us terribly, I have this sense that a tremendous reversal has taken place since James's idea of Europe as the glory of civilization, and it was this country that saved Western Europe, and it is always with me that Europe is never again going to be Henry James's Europe, and that America, with our difficulties and with our imperfections, has become the center, the matrix, even the vortex of civilization.
Do you want to respond?
I'm not sure that I have a good answer to that question. For me, particularly in writing Great House, I was really interested in what happens when characters shed nation, culture, everything that exists in some kind of external way. And as trying to occupy these characters as their author, I felt like I somehow was just tunneling as far as I could into the deepest part of their inner lives. It seems to me that one of the very unique opportunities that literature allows us is this chance to step into the inner life, to take on the conditions of another existence and to become another person. And particularly in this novel, and this may change in another novel in the future, I'm sure it will, I wanted to do that as deeply as I could.
This is another, I guess, this versus that question. It started as one for Nicole, but maybe Cynthia, you'll have something to say as well. It says, do you think the thoughts of old men are essentially different from the thoughts of old women? And this is a question, I guess, addressed to Nicole. What is it about old men that intrigues you so much?
Who asked this question? Where are you? Well, I can't tell you that this is an original question. It may be the question I'm most often asked. And the answer that I often give, although I think I should start to change it, is that maybe I just am an old man inside, which I think is probably to a degree true. But maybe the truer, more authentic answer is that it seems to me very important to me as a writer to feel that I am free to invent, to imagine, to inhabit another life, to become another person, all of those things. And yet at the same time, to freely invent or imagine is basically to write things that feel to me inauthentic, if it feels some way fraudulent. There has to be this perfect marriage of a thing, a person, a condition that feels deeply personal to me, which doesn't mean that I've experienced it, but it may mean that I have deep empathy for it, or I've observed it, or whatever it is. But there has to be this marriage of the personal with the invented, and somehow to occupy the life of an old man, somebody who is at the other end of the spectrum of life, pressed up against death, and who has who doesn't look much like me on the surface, allows me a kind of a liberty in a way to talk about things that feel most like myself, most like my own life.
Cynthia?
Okay, that was so beautifully, eloquently expressed. Ditto.
Well, then this is one for both, and Cynthia, we'll start with you. It's apt, given that we're at the Poetry Center. It says each of you started out writing poetry. Do you still write poetry? And how does writing poems prepare you for writing novels?
You start.
Well, I quit writing poetry when I was 36. And somebody, it could have been Goethe, it could have been T.S. Eliot, it could have been Oscar Wilde, one of those three anyhow, said that all writers begin as poets, but then a winnowing out occurs, and the poets who really persist on a different plane, a more sublime plane, remain poets, and the rest of us become writers.
Ditto. I think I feel really almost exactly the same way, and I'll only add to that it occurred to me, I stopped writing poetry earlier than that, and I had wanted to be a poet since I was about 15, and then when I was 25 I wrote my first novel, and I haven't written poetry since. And it seemed to me at that moment, that sort of turning point, that poetry, which seems so small and yet can contain infinity, is kind of in some ways like a room. I mean, the word stanza, of course, is Italian for room, and like a room, there's this sense, at least I had the sense writing poetry, that there's this possibility for perfection, that if you only were good enough, the poem could be perfect. And a novel, it turns out, is imperfect by nature, by definition. It's simply impossible to think of a perfect novel. They are all inherently flawed, partly because the form just is so ill-defined that you can't possibly ever write a perfect one. And I think somehow that sense of the novel as imperfect reminded me of a house. I mean, I think it was just a question of time, but I called the novel Great House, because this idea of a form that's like a house where there's always something broken, like a window that doesn't open or it's stuck, or the ceiling is, caving in some part. But, you can make a life in it as a writer. You can live in it for years and years and years.
Describing my house?
Maybe, or mine. So that's all.
I'll add a follow-up, which would be how important has reading poetry been in your careers as, I guess, prose writers, if in fact it remains important? Do you want to talk about that?
I read poetry. A poet that I've been reading a lot lately is Dana Gioia. And speaking of the difference between poetry and the novel, Dana Gioia has a kind of principle or thesis that he wants to reintroduce into the language, which is the narrative poem, which will achieve everything that the novel does, that loose, baggy monster, and at the same time retain the precision, the succinctness, and the pressured quality of the poetic line. And he seems to be working on this, and I've read some poetry of his that have achieved it. It's very difficult, by and large, though, to read contemporary poets, with glorious exceptions, obviously. But if I can call them, the workshop poets are writing telegrams or letters, and the casualness of these stanzas can easily become paragraphs in a letter to a friend. And I don't see that pressure toward the transcendent or to the whole vision that a narrative poem, such as Robert Frost wrote, coming out of most contemporary poets. And I do read them, and I'm often disappointed.
There are certain poets that I still always return to, along with my favorite novelists. And one poet who I feel like really taught me or gave me a picture of what was possible as a writer and gave me a sense of what kind of writer I wanted to be is the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert. I don't know if anyone in the audience has read him, but should I ever forget what kind of writer I want to be, I just need to go back and read him again. And if you would like to read him, try to find the translations by John and Bogdania Carpenter, who brought him into English like a pair of angels. There are more recent and actually in-print translations, but they're not very good. So,
Cynthia, this one is for you. It says, are you aware that many school districts in New Jersey have banned the shawl? What can teachers say to argue against such ignorance?
That's rather astounding news. I would say I don't mind. I am surprised, and the reason I don't mind is if they are substituting for it works by actual survivors or very important documents. I mean, if they're going to ban the shawl and introduce Primo Levi, that would be a very salubrious thing to do.
And this is just the last question. It's for both of you. It says each of your new novels features musicians whose talents are treated with awe by other characters in the books. Do all writers secretly wish that they were musicians?
What was the last line?
It's, do all writers secretly wish that they were musicians?
You answered that.
I think all writers not so secretly wish that they were anything but writers. And in the case of the musician in Great House, she actually came to be like so many things in my novel simply because I had a kind of itch that I just needed to scratch, which in this case was an image. I had heard a story from a friend of a friend about this man who was a truly great pianist and then at some point gave it up because he, for various reasons, but one of his frustrations was that when the piano sat on the floor, as almost all pianos do, the notes didn't sound purely because they hit off the floor in such a way that I suppose corrupted them. And so later in life, this man who is a very fine carpenter found a way to suspend his piano in the air with this rope and pulley, and built some seat, some net or something where he could play this piano in the air and have the notes sound purely. And I thought there was something so beautiful about that. I don't have to tell you why. And I mean, it sort of goes on and on about why that is beautiful. But I simply wanted to write about that suspended piano.
Well, I had a very explicit reason for writing about a musician, in fact, a composer. I think my reason can be best summed up by the word vengeance. The reason is that a friend in London pointed out to me that I've never written a word about music, and there's a reason for that, because I'm a kind of musical imbecile. So I said, I'll show you, and that's why I wrote about a musician.
Thank you both, and thank you.